The Arabs kicked out the Jews and forced them into exile. Not the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks or Romans, but those Arab invaders. At least that's what Netanyahu thinks and believes, and would want you also to believe.
For roughly 2,000 years, we were conquered by the Romans, we were conquered by the Byzantines. They did a lot of bad things to us, but they didn't really exile us, contrary to what people think, okay? The loss of our land actually occurred when the Arab conquest took place in the 7th century. The Arabs burst out from Arabia, and they did something that no other conqueror, not the Romans, not the Byzantines, not the Greeks before them, not Alexander the Great, nobody did before. They actually started taking over the land of the Jewish farmer. They brought in military colonies that took over the land. And gradually, over the next 2 centuries, the Jews became a minority in our land. So it is under the Arab conquest that the Jews lost their homeland. The Arabs were the colonials, the Jews were the natives dispossessed.
Don't believe him? Well, apparently we're told to Google the information ourselves. But let's address these claims from Netanyahu. Is it true? Did the Arabs kick out the Jews and colonize the region as Netanyahu claims? Firstly, the term arabization used by historians does not refer to Arab colonization of the region, nor does it mean that the Arabs came out of the Arabian Peninsula, ethnically cleansed the lands they conquered and moved their people in. That's just not what arabization refers to. And the example of Palestinian Muslims and their existence demonstrates this point. That's because genetic studies show that Palestinian Muslims have a lineage going back to the Canaanites, an ancient people that predates even the existence of Jews.
The Jews are here. To try to say that they weren't here and that the Palestinians were here thousands of years ago is ridiculous. Anybody who can, you can actually Google this and find out how absurd this thing is.
Archaeological and genetic data support that both Jews and Palestinians came from the ancient Canaanites. So Arabization refers to the process of Arabs, after accepting Islam, expanding their territory and dominance over the surrounding lands outside of the Arabian Peninsula. They defeated empires like the Romans and Persians, and their lands and peoples adopted the Arabic language. This is why we have Arab Christians. They aren't Christians who colonized Syria from the Arabian Peninsula. These are people of the Levant who adopted the Arabic language and by virtue of this are known to have been Arabized. Hence we have the Arabic Bible. Arabic Christians also using Allah, the word Allah, for God, and have adopted some Arabic cultural practices, even if they didn't adopt Islam. For example, the use of Arabic names. Yes, Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, after converting to Islam and unifying under the Rashidun Khilafah, expanded their authority through fighting the main empires of their time, the Romans and the Persians. They also used peace agreements with the indigenous populations of those lands. Therefore, indigenous populations accepted the authority of Arab Muslims while also being allowed to stay in their homes, work on their lands, and even practice their own religion. Many Arabs settled in these new lands, but they didn't ethnically cleanse the land of non-Muslims. Hence why today we see Coptic Christians of Egypt or Arab Jews prior to the creation of Israel having lived in Muslim lands for centuries. I'm not here to argue against claims of oppression by Islamophobes, but let's be clear. Firstly, Jews and Christians welcomed Muslims in Spain, even fighting against the Visigoths to prevent their return. Similarly, Jews fought alongside Muslims against the Crusades, and when Jews were expelled from Spain, they were welcomed by the Ottoman Khilafah. As Gustave Le Bon stated, the tolerance of Muhammad towards the Jews and Christians was truly grand. The founders of other religions that appeared before him, Judaism and Christianity in particular, did not prescribe such goodwill. His caliphs followed the same policy, and his tolerance has been acknowledged by skeptics and believers alike when they study the history of Arabs in depth. Similarly, Bernard Lewis, in his book Jews of Islam, also stated, generally the Jewish people were allowed to practice their religion and live according to laws and scriptures of their community. Furthermore, the restrictions to which they were subject were social and symbolic rather than tangible and practical in character. That is to say, these regulations serve to define the relationship between the two communities and not to oppress the Jewish population. The point is, unlike Zionism's attempt to ethnically cleanse the land and change the demographics so Jews can become the majority, Muslims and Arabs never did such a thing. Under the Umayyad Khilafah, the majority of the population were non-Muslims. Similarly, Palestine and Jerusalem were majority non-Muslim and only became majority Muslim after Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi rahimahullah liberated Jerusalem from the Crusades, with large groups of non-Muslims now converting to Islam. So what about the Jews? Was it the Arab Muslims who exiled them from Jerusalem and Palestine? Anyone with a basic understanding of Jewish history knows that the exiling of Jews from Palestine first took place by the Assyrians around 733 BCE, then by the Babylonians around 597 BCE, where they were exiled, only to be allowed back in under Cyrus the Great some 50 years later. Many Jews decided in fact to remain back in Babylon. Later, around 70 CE, after the destruction of the Second Temple, many were exiled again, and even more after the rebellion against the Roman rule in 137 CE. After the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, Jews were banned from settling in Jerusalem. By the time the Muslim Arab Authority came to Palestine, the vast majority of Jews were living outside of Palestine. They were banned from Jerusalem, and the Jews of Palestine were dispersed to remote rural areas on the very edges of Palestine. The majority of the population of Palestine at that time was in fact Christian. So it's clear that historical research shows that neither it was Muslims nor the Arabs that kicked out the Jews. This was never the case. It was under Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu anh who actually allowed Jews to return back to Palestine and Jerusalem.
The Caliph goes, okay, I want to meet some of the Jews living in Jerusalem. And Sophronius goes, there are no Jews in Jerusalem. How could there be no Jews? And he says, well, us Christians, we pretty much murder them every chance we get. We really hate Jews. In fact, in the war we just did against the Persians, the Jews sided with the Persians. And so we murdered 20,000 Jews in Jerusalem and completely purged the city of its remaining Jewish population. And Omar ibn al-Khattab goes, no, this is wrong. You can't do this. And so he turns to a convert to Islam, a Jewish convert to Islam, and he says, I need you to find me 80 Jewish families that were willing to volunteer to move to Jerusalem so we can reestablish a Jewish presence in the city.
The general policy of the caliphs was to allow Jews to return and live in Palestine if they wanted to. I'm not saying there weren't periods where Jews weren't treated well, but the claim that the Arab Muslims kicked out Jews from Palestine is just false. Many Jews came back to Palestine after Muslim rule. Some periods saw a decline, but this wasn't due to being forced off the land, kicked off the land, or ethnically cleansed off the land. Rather, economic factors like maybe famine or declining trade or high taxation led to Jews migrating off their own accord outside of Palestine to other lands. In fact, even Orthodox Jewish position even held that returning to the land, i.e. of land of Palestine and Jerusalem, wasn't even necessary until the advent of their Messiah. Netanyahu is falsifying history to paint the picture that Arabs kicked out the Jews, colonized the land, and that Jews are simply trying to right a wrong done against them by Arab colonizers. This is false. Arabs never colonized the land under any academic definition of colonization. They didn't ethnically cleanse the land in order to justify their authority as we see Zionism does. We have already shown through genetic studies that Palestinian Muslims are genetically related to the indigenous population of Palestine, and it's simply false to claim that Arabs kicked out the Jews. In fact, the opposite happened, where they were allowed back into Palestine after being kicked out by the Romans, which was maintained even after the Romans officially adopted Christianity. Don't allow Zionist propagandists to reimagine history that tries to whitewash what they really are. They are colonizers whose very existence is dependent upon the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Their continued existence as a Jewish state is basically dependent upon changing the demographics, making Jews the majority within that land, and therefore justifying their Zionist entity and therefore, quote unquote, their Jewish state. All the while, America and the UK, among other Western countries, providing them with weapons, with trade, with aid, with unstinting support because it serves their Western interest to do so, to see this Zionist entity in the heart of the Arab and Muslim lands.